My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and this is 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the simple and yet very strategic choices that all of us can make in order to become the very best version of ourselves. Today in the studio, I sit with Martha Chandran-Dickerson, who is an educator, who is a bridge builder, who is a thought leader, who really deeply desires to take common issues, important issues, and go deeper in them. Today, our conversation is about loving the earth, and it is far more than just taking that plastic bottle and putting it in the recycling bin. We're going to talk about environmental racism. We're going to talk about how the fashion choices we make are going to actually tie into whether or not we love the earth, and how, by loving the earth in very tangible ways, we not only bless and encourage people on the other side of the planet, but those in our very backyard, and even personally benefiting ourselves. We're going to talk about ancestry. We're going to talk about Native Americans. We're going to talk about indigenous people in this very comprehensive and interesting conversation that you'll probably hear nowhere else as we talk about environmentalism and what it means to love the earth. Enjoy this episode. Listen in. Martha, welcome back to 3 Words. It's always a pleasure to have you on camera with me and engaging in a really significant conversation. So just to jump in, what are our 3 words for today?
The 3 words for today is love the earth.
Love the earth. Now, I'm guessing there's several people already who are like, ooh, I cannot wait to hear what Martha is going to say, because those who follow 3 Words podcast and have heard your conversation on Make a Mess, Fight for Justice, Your Story Matters, usually you have this amazing way of just kind of taking different twists and turns in a conversation and making me sit here and go, I never thought about that before. And I'm guessing that you're going to do the same thing as we talk about this conversation of loving the earth. So from what I understand, you're going to tie it into this conversation around fight for justice. So let's go there. Lead us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. Yes, I think that when we look at the environment or any issues, surrounding the environment, the discussions typically focus on plants and animals. We have a very binary way of looking at environmental issues, and then we forget about how environmental issues impact communities, particularly vulnerable communities. And I don't think that it means that we shouldn't be worried about animals and plants. I think we should be concerned about all of it, the totality of what makes up the environment. We're all part of this ecosystem. We're all coexisting together. And so I think it's really essential to be able to consider every aspect of what it means to be environmentally conscious, and that it does intersect with issues of justice and injustice. And so we have to broaden our lens in terms of how we look at it. And I think, especially for us as Americans, we're here in America, and it's just the statistics are very demoralizing when you consider that we're only a small percentage of the world. And I want to read something that I actually found on Vox for you. Vox, I don't know if you ever read. It's an online publication. They have very nuanced reporting.
Okay.
But this is, I don't know how recent this is, but I think it still speaks to what we're discussing today. The U.S. has an outsized role in global warming, or if you want to use climate change, despite recent progress. When it comes to total greenhouse gas emissions, the U.S. does a behind the back, through the legs, backboard breaking dunk over China and the Soviet Union. So using a basketball metaphor, which I think is really important. America is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, even though it only makes up about 4% of the world's population. So even
4% of the world's population is America, and we consume a lot.
We consume a lot, and we generate a lot of waste. We're one of the biggest contaminants. And that is not acceptable. And so it behooves us as Americans to be more mindful of how, we are this much of the world's population, and yet we're contributing so much damage to the earth. We're impacting other communities in other parts of the world, including our own. And I think a good place to start in terms of how can we course correct, how can we ameliorate what's going on, is to consider the people that stewarded the land that we're on, the people that were here before us. and that would be the indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Native Americans.
Absolutely.
They had this wisdom about, the earth. They had a very special relationship. They understood that they were part of nature. And I think it's really important to kind of center their voices around, environmental issues. They're usually at the forefront, not maybe, when you turn on the media, but in terms of the legwork and pulling up, their sleeves and actually showing up and having skin in the game, the ones that have been most impacted are the ones that are showing up and doing the work. And I would also like to read a quote from a chief, two chiefs actually. So this is Chief Luther Standing Bear, who said, "The elders were wise. They knew that man's heart away from nature becomes hard. They knew that lack of respect for growing, living things soon led to a lack of respect for humans too."
Wow.
And you see that. And then
I do see that, yeah.
Yeah, and then here's another one, and you can let me know what you think. Chief Seattle said, "The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected, like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." So again, those two quotes kind of like, emphasizing, underscoring the idea that we all exist together. We're not like here to dominate. We're not also here to be crushed. We're all here coexisting, and we need to respect the earth, and we also need to respect each other and the creatures that are, lower in stature in the ecosystem.
Well, I love how you're connecting the ideas of treating each other as a global village. We talked a lot about that. Obviously, the choices we make as human beings, it affects people not only next door, but potentially across the planet, as well as within our variety of communities. But also now you're connecting those relationships, not just with our fellow beings, our fellow humans, but actually with the earth itself. Because I don't know much about it, I didn't study this. I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist, similar to you. You're an educator. And so I just value learning from you and learning from others. And I know, and I hear this all the time, that, there's so much damage we're doing to the earth. And if obviously the earth is not thriving, we cannot thrive. But also if we're choosing to overconsume or overcontaminate, we're going to affect not only the vibrancy of the earth, but all the people that are now residing on this global, as a part of our global village. I'm going to hit pause at this point in the podcast episode to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to subscribe to our podcasting platforms, and to share this particular episode on environmentalism with a friend.
Absolutely. And I think also, since, when we're considering other people, other beings that exist in this, it's also part of like being environmentally conscious is also being honoring of the land. Part of that, is, learning from indigenous people in terms of how to care for the earth. But also the other thing is I wanted to discuss briefly today is this idea that we're still struggling to acknowledge the fact that we are on stolen land. Every single one of us are here because someone else was here and stewarded the land, and then they were stripped away from it. And I think it's very important when we have this sort of respect for the land, then we're more prone to honor it in every little decision that we make.
Including the people who were the original caretakers of that.
Exactly, including honoring them and their ongoing issues and struggles that they're experiencing, and realizing that they're not a monolith. They are made up of several nations and tribes. But the problem is where we are right now, Wood County, we're, as you know, swampland. So it's very hard to have a very accurate land acknowledgement. It's hard. And I'm sure you being at the university, you've probably heard these conversations happening and how
a little bit, yeah,
they want to have a very meaningful and, comprehensive land acknowledgement, but it takes time to construct one. But in speaking to one of the people that I volunteer with, one of the organizations I'm on, she's Indigenous American, biracial, Caucasian as well. But she said sometimes it's not so much about having an accurate, and perfect land acknowledgement. It's about just having some sort of workable land acknowledgement that you can refine and, improve upon over time. But it's just acknowledging that this was not ours. And there was a lot of like brutality that happened, pillaging and, massacring that happened in order for us to even be here.
I love when we have our conversations, Martha, about all various issues around justice and inclusion and thoughtful, provocative, but thoughtful commitments to helping the greater good. You oftentimes teach me and you remind me that we don't need to do it perfectly. We, like you said, we need at least at this point acknowledge it. Let's make some progress. Let's take a posture of humility, a posture of a learner, and say, wait, I never thought about that before versus not me. I didn't. Why should I? And we tend to be defensive when we have these conversations.
Yeah, it's not helpful. And the defensive just doesn't make sense because the people that were victimized, it wasn't their fault either. So if they don't get to opt out, then neither do we, because we're all beneficiaries of that,
of those choices,
of those things that happened. But what I did find, and, it can be, like I said, a disclaimer, is that we are on the stolen ancestral lands of the Miami, Ottawa, Wyandotte, Erie, Seneca, and Potawatomi.
You mean here where we are in Northwest Ohio right now?
In Wood County. So this is what my research has led me to, but I'm not saying this is perfect. And thank you for acknowledging the fact that this process of dismantling, systems of oppression is not a perfect process. And we're going to make mistakes, and that's fine, but we're dedicated to it.
I love that. And I know that you had, when we actually walked into the studio today, we were talking about, what should I wear to, in light of what you're wearing? And you said, I actually chose clothes today in light of this topic. And I have no idea what that means, but talk to us about that. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, you obviously can see what Martha's wearing, but you said even the choices that you made in regards to what you wore into the studio today reflected this conversation. How?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I just want to again, put it out there. I am not better than anybody else in terms of my decisions. I have done damage to the earth through some of my decisions, but I am trying to be a little bit more thoughtful, in certain areas, in all areas of my life. But I do, I'm wearing Nike Air Force Ones, and so I don't know that that's an environmentally conscious thing, but, I like my sneakers. I get that from my son.
Always humble. Martha, always humble.
But so this outfit that I'm wearing is from a fair trade company that invests in women in vulnerable communities all over the world, including that's what I love, is including here in America. So they create employment and dignified wages for women in oppressive situations and circumstances. So women fleeing the, commercial sex trafficking industry, or women that are fleeing intimate partner violence, and women in very poor communities that are illiterate and are not able to support their families, or, all over the world. And India is one of the countries, and as you know, India is where, my family's from. It's where my heritage is. So this outfit was made in India. And the women that work here are also women for the company that also are, overcoming, some of them have overcome addiction. And so it's a company that is respectful to the earth and make sure that they're environmentally conscious in their practices. So throughout the whole supply chain process, they're very considerate of every piece of what makes up the environment, human beings, the earth, all the moving pieces. And I think that's really important, that when we're investing in companies, that we're investing in those that are actually making a difference in people's lives, especially women, since women are the ones that are usually hardest hit when it comes to employment. The employment gap. Women are the ones that are affected the most. Women in a lot of these countries don't get educated. They're working to provide for their families and not making a lot of money. And to tie to that, the fast fashion industry, I don't know if you know much about it, but it is contributing to a lot of, the pollution the toxic waste that's in the environment that's creating all these terrible emissions.
Yeah. Fast fashion.
And that
I'm going to study it. Thank you.
That wasn't the case. I watched a documentary that just blew my mind. It's called The True Cost, I think. And it was on Netflix, and now I don't know where you can watch it. I think it's not anywhere really, but you can.
So to get a shirt for $2.99, what is the cost of the environment into the communities?
So,
is that the idea?
Yeah. So I'm not going to name names about these companies, but you can imagine. So think about the companies that produce a lot of inventory and have a lot of seasons. Like before, back in the day, you're slightly a little older than me, but I just remember growing up, we only had like 1 or 2 seasons. And now
Cold
it's
and
like
hot.
there's
Cold
so
season and hot
now
season.
there's like 8 seasons in 1 year, and it's like, you're getting these things sent to your house, like purchase this and purchase that, and like every store has their mannequins dressed differently every week, and so it's like consume, it's consume. So people are buying, and a lot of people are over shopping and overspending because they're trying to fill a void in their lives. So if you're having some unresolved stuff in your life, there's like past trauma that you haven't unpacked. For a lot of people, and this is a phenomenon everywhere in the world, but particularly here in America, where we have credit cards, where we can just like hit a button on our phone and like stuff gets dispatched to our door. Buying clothes, accumulating a lot of stuff, and then feeling like, oh, I'm bored now, I'm going to go and accumulate more, because it's not really about the stuff as much as it is that, fixing that, scratching that itch, that you have.
And even as a life coach, I'm intrigued because now you're connecting, obviously, the unresolved issues in our life that we're not being transparent about and vulnerable about, and we're not actually dealing with the emotional dimension in a healthy way. Now it's tying into purchasing, which is then tying into connecting to marginalized communities, which is affecting the earth and pollution. Yeah. Martha, this is so eye-opening. And I think even what you're doing for me again is you're actually taking the theme that I care most about. And that is that every choice counts and every moment matters, that there are no freebies in choices, that every decision has an impact, that every single decision has, to quote Socrates, both a pleasure and a price. I love that you are showing that even the clothes that you buy and the choices that you make in regards to these things, they matter immensely. Every choice counts. And I appreciate that, because obviously we care a lot about that at 3 Words Podcast and DMB Coaching. But I didn't really think about it in terms of even like clothing and all the things that you're talking about. I'm guessing some of our listeners, though, and if I can even say this out loud, are probably thinking, wow, that's interesting. But to do this, it would take a lot of work, reflection, thoughtfulness. And what happens is that we don't want to put in that work. And I was actually in LA yesterday.
Okay.
Just flew back yesterday, actually last night from LA, and now back in Northwest Ohio. And I had a conversation yesterday where we were talking about what is selfishness. And this is kind of how I'd like to begin to kind of turn our conversation toward the end and the conclusion, is that what you're describing is that oftentimes when we're not taking this seriously, when we're not loving the earth, as you have described, it's because we're selfish. And selfishness is putting our wants before others' needs. That in its essence, that's what selfishness is. Putting our wants, which you just described. There's all these things we want, and we want this, in front of other people's needs. And we're hurting other people. We're hurting populations. We're hurting communities. We're hurting the planet. Final thoughts from you as you think about this topic of love this earth, or even a response to even what I just shared.
Yeah. No, it's great. We're hurting other people, but we're also hurting ourselves. Like we're none of this is disconnected.
We're in this together. Yeah.
So this addressed trauma in our bodies, like I'm reading My Grandmother's Hands right now, and it talks about how we think of, oppression in terms of systems, which it is, but it's also in terms of what happens to your body. And so what happens to your body is now being transmitted through our choices, which is, I know, what you love to talk about.
I do.
And then our choices now, if it's like, over compulsive shopping, and there's even a term, obsessive compulsive, I don't know. But it's it leads to these choices that are harmful, and then they then traumatize the earth. And I also wanted to, in closing, talk about how, when we're talking about the environment, it's not just about cute little pandas. I was watching John Oliver. I don't know if you ever watched John Oliver,
no.
but I love him. But he was just talking about why are we caring about pandas more than we do poor communities? I mean, it's funny, but it's true. But I think we should care for pandas, obviously.
Of course.
He was like joking and saying like all they do is fall out of trees, But we should care about poor communities because environmental racism is a real thing. I mean, if we even go back into the history of this country, and actually the legacy of that even impacts my family because of redlining. I don't know if you've heard of so redlining forced descendants of the enslaved, so the African Americans that were wanting to purchase homes, and forced them to buy property in certain areas. And those were usually depressed areas. And those were typically areas in which industries would come and like dump their, toxic waste or have landmines over there. And then this would create...
So we're not dropping that into the suburbs? We're taking it other place. Exactly.
Right.
That's
because
the point.
like poor people don't matter. Their lives don't matter. Black people's lives don't matter. And so you're dumping all this waste and setting up all these industries. A lot of these communities are like bumping up into these industrial like places. And so there's the life expectancy in that communities are significantly lower. They struggle with asthma and other, issues like that. And so you see how all these things are interconnected in a way that we often think of them as disconnected things. And so in our family, like, Greg's dad was an extremely hardworking man, blue-collar man. I mean, he built a car engine when he was a teenager. He could have been an engineer, but he worked very hard and could have been anything because he was so brilliant. But he saved up his blue-collar earnings, put all 4 kids through college debt-free, was able to buy 2 properties, but those 2 properties were in areas that were incredibly depressed to the point that it's almost like you're not even going to make an investment. Whereas other families who are of a different racial, background were able to purchase properties in more preferable areas, and then they built this generational wealth that they were able to pass down to their children. So when we're talking about these things, they're all kind of interconnected. And so because of redlining, these communities are hardest hit by environmental racism. And so I think we can think about what we're doing personally, but we can also think about systemically, what policies are we supporting, in terms of making sure that we're not perpetuating these systems in which poorer communities stay poor and are impacted the most by these environmental disasters that we're creating by our choices.
As always, you are my teacher and mentor, Martha, and I'm really encouraged to sit with you, but also a little unsettled because I'm thinking about my choices, right? I'm thinking about my contributions to some of the things that you just described. But to our viewers and listeners who are tapped into this particular episode, I guess what I would say to them, and even just would say to each other, because we need to speak truth to each other, is what I'm hearing you say is that by loving the earth, we are loving communities. Not only near us, but communities that are very, very far away. As we love the earth, we're loving individuals and families and human beings that are interconnected to us because we are one global village. But as well, and you said it earlier, we're also loving ourselves because we're making choices that are going to profoundly affect us personally. That this topic is more than just recycling. Is more than just taking your plastic water bottle and putting it in the recycling container, but thank you for enlarging our perspective about what it means to truly, truly love the earth. Martha, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.